Hello and welcome to the RLAS webinar series, Creating Safer Spaces for LGBTQ+ students. This webinar is part of the research study Implementing School Nursing Strategies to Reduce LGBTQ Adolescent Suicide, or RLAS. The study is funded by the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Let me begin by introducing myself. So my name is Jen Jefferson, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am one of the instructional coaches for this RLAS project. I'm also the founder of Prevention at Play, and my areas of specialty include gender and sexuality, bullying, suicide prevention, team building, project management, grant writing, curriculum development. I'm also a provider of experiential activities for both youth and adults and workshops tailored to school staff and LGBTQ+ populations. So let me introduce you to my co-presenters. This is Luz Marina Serrano.
Hey there. Hi. So I'm the program manager with the Santa Fe Mountain Center, New Mexico Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network. Also, like Jen said, my name is Luz Marina Serrano, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And my areas of specialty include working with LGBTQ communities, on bullying and bias, and race and gender justice, and working with youth, and specifically healing through community organizing.
Awesome. And here's Chris.
Hi, my name is Chris Allers. I'm the youth outreach worker for the New Mexico GSA network at the Santa Fe Mountain Center, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. Most of what I do includes working with LGBTQ youth around leadership, engaging young people, talking about race and gender justice, and also helping develop GSA clubs.
So overall, this webinar is going to be about how you can help create a safer space in your school environment. The specific objectives are to identify 3 methods to create safer spaces for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, etc. students. Also to describe the needs, purpose, and benefits of GSA clubs. You'll be able to describe how to implement a school-wide Safe Zones program. And last, you'll be able to name key components of some model policies. So we're going to start with telling you a little bit about what the New Mexico GSA network is.
So the New Mexico Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network is a network that builds resiliency and positive identity development, self-efficacy, mental health, and empowerment of LGBTQ youth through peer training, peer support, and leadership development. And we do that a number of ways. We have a couple services that we offer throughout the year that help work with this framework in mind. And one of them is our youth events that we do throughout the year. We have about 9 that we do, and that's specifically tailored for young people between the ages of 13 and 24. And we also provide GSA support. So, for example, if a GSA wants to start up and just kind of begin working in their school, that's something where we provide support at the beginning stages. Or if a GSA has been in the school for 3 or 4 years, we also provide support. So it looks different for each GSA and each different community. We also do a lot of adult and staff trainings. As I said, I do a lot of work on bullying and bias, specifically on race and gender. And so we tailor specific workshops to different communities and schools around these specific topics. And we do education awareness campaigns where we call them Days of Action at the network, and it basically are days that highlight specific LGBTQ days are important for our young people and LGBTQ folks in general. And we hope that through a lot of these services that we offer, that our young people or adults get to sort of network. And so not only do we provide a space for folks to talk to each other and interact through social media, but we also provide spaces where young people can engage with them and talk with each other and create community. So what, GSA clubs, what's the purpose of them? Ultimately, right, we want GSA clubs to feel a comfortable space for young people to just be who they authentically are. And the way that they can do that, they provide a safe and supportive environment for young people. Often our young people don't get to have spaces to just be who they are, and more often than not, these young people will have a GSA club just to have that moment to be who they are in a space that feels fun and engaging. And what we've seen is that it usually improves school climate because GSA clubs tend to bring awareness to LGBTQ facts that need to be brought up. And they help fight transphobia and homophobia and really any other phobia, right, that comes across LGBTQ folks. And what's really interesting about our work specifically is that through helping fight transphobia or homophobia or kind of helping challenging systems that are set in place, they often will end up working around other issues, whether it be racism or ableism, all these things that affect all of us. And we have kind of a saying at our network that we're not one identity, we have a number of identities, and it's really important to see all of who we are in the work that we do. And the benefits of GSA clubs. So we said on the last slide, it specifically helps improve school climate, but it does that by making schools safer and braver. And so what we hear right now is that usually language and harassment is reduced in schools. And usually by having a GSA club, then adult staff members can be identified, and then young people have somebody they can go and talk to or feel like they can just vent and be who they are. Here's a couple stats. We know you love stats. Continuing with that. So if you notice over on the left side, it's blue, and those are schools with GSAs. On the right, it's green, and those are without GSAs. And so you can see some of the stark differences of what it means to have a GSA, because it's, all the things that we said around feeling staff are supportive or hearing language or even remarks around staff. It's a lot better when there's a club to sort of, hey, this isn't okay. And so there's a couple of stats for you all. What else that we've heard and we've seen is that ultimately young people will feel safer by having a club. They feel like they have a place of belonging because they get to be who they are, right? Higher GPAs, most likely to pursue post-secondary education, and less likely to miss school due to fear of safety. And so all these things are things that we want for all of our young people, right? And specifically, these are things that our young LGBTQ folks are facing of not having. So it's important to see these and see these things are positive things that GSA clubs offer. So GSA clubs. So we've gone over the benefits and why it's important, but what exactly are they? So a little bit of the history of GSA clubs on a national level is that they started out of California back in the early to mid 2000s, sort of this rarity that over time has now included the rest of the United States. And so we here at the New Mexico GSA Network, we're a pilot program out of the GSA network in California. And so we have been around for, blanking on the number,
since 2005.
Thanks, Jen. Since 2005, and we now have little over, maybe now 70 some GSAs, I would say, and that
in
number,
New
Mexico, and that number could be going up. We just every year sort of shifts, and we just kind of keep track here and there. So, so the number's grown, just so you know, and we have them all. Some grade schools are starting to ask for GSAs, as well as in college. So,
can I add something? Yeah, and so a lot of GSAs started at the college level and have worked their way down, and so it's actually back as early as the 90s in some places where there were GSA clubs, and then in the 2000s was when we really started seeing that more of, I would call it like a surge, but there definitely were some in the 90s that were in colleges and working their way into high schools, and then they've really been blossoming.
Yeah. And I would say really, I mean, high school is a really good place to have a GSA. I feel like every high school should have one.
But all that said, still, it's not uncommon at all for middle schools to have GSAs.
Right. And elementary schools in some places.
Yeah. So, and they will look different. So I think kind of talking a little bit, let's go a little bit down to like what kind of types of GSA clubs. So this is how we look at GSAs here in New Mexico. So they're the social and activist and supportive framework. So they can all look differently. So you can have one that's just really about being a social place and hanging out and having some good food and just being in that space, and that's totally okay. There's other ones that want to be more supportive, and they offer a little bit more about serious conversations. I've been in a couple of GSAs where it's a place they get to really kind of talk about maybe what's happening at home or experience outside of school. And then there's an activist GSA. And that kind of, by the time you're an activist GSA, really you're kind of including the social and the supportive piece, right? Because to be an activist GSA, you really have to have lots of trust in your peers, in your advisors, and your environment to really get to that point. And so when we meet with GSAs, we always encourage folks to really have the foundation around being social and supportive before they jump to being an activist GSA. And the hope is that you can have a little bit of all, right? So that folks feel comfortable just like showing up and having pizza and maybe talking about their favorite pop star to, hey, like this is what's happening in the news and we need to talk about it. So, so the different types of GSA clubs. Also, I think it's important to highlight based on if there are middle school, grade school, it's going to look different than being at the college level or high school. Mm-hmm. And that's okay too, not to force anything, just to let it happen organically. And so a little about the name, and I think this is important specifically because the name has shifted a little bit throughout time and more recently. So GSA clubs has actually been gay straight alliances in the past, and they still are like that in some places around the country. We here in New Mexico have shifted our name to be Genders and Sexualities Alliance. And the reason we did that is because we noticed that our demographic didn't really wasn't really speaking to gay straight alliance, and we wanted to really acknowledge all the folks that we were serving, and including folks who identify as two-spirit or gender nonconforming or trans. Like this really sort of got to be a name that was representative of all of our people, and gay straight wasn't really fitting. And so we actually see this trend starting to happen. So it's happening here in New Mexico. I noticed some GSAs will have names like Queer Straight Alliance, Colors. I've seen a couple different names. Also around the nation, there's some clubs and networks who are changing their names as well, just to kind of fit what's happening with specifically our young people. Yeah, so a little bit more about GSA clubs. So GSA clubs must be allowed. I think that's something that folks should really understand and know. And often that's really kind of the thing that I get is a call or an email saying, hey, like my principal won't allow this, or blah, blah, blah won't allow this. Okay, like that can be the case where they feel uncomfortable or they don't want to. But at the end of the day, all clubs must be allowed. So if you have a club that is the Gummy Bear Club, you're most likely, like you can have the GSA club. So I think that's important to really know, and there is something backing it up, which is the Equal Access Act, which I think folks are getting, right?
Mm-hmm. There'll be handout materials associated with it.
So you can look at that, and we also have if folks have questions about that, my information will be at the end, and we can talk a little bit more about that, because this is something usually that's important to bring to an administrator to say, hey, you may not like this, but this is what the law says ultimately. And it's important to have that. So,
and that act also says that you can't force just the students in the GSA club to have parental permission if you don't have that for all of your clubs. So it's really saying you have to provide equal access in many different ways. It's got to be the same as all the other clubs as well.
And which also reminds me, I think that there is one exception, and I always think that there's when, let's say your school decides to not have any clubs at all. That would be the only exception, which we've seen at the network. There's some schools who decided not to have any clubs, and that's the only time when a GSA club cannot happen in school.
And it applies to public schools and any sort of public charter that's receiving federal monies that unfortunately does not apply to private schools.
Exactly. So a couple other things that are really important to know is that it be student initiated. So a lot of well-meaning staff will want to start a GSA, and I think that's awesome and great because we need you all as supportive folks and allies. However, it's really important that the clubs get started by a young person. And usually there's a young person that wants to start a club. They just don't really know, like, what is a GSA? What do you mean I can have a special club? Like, there's no, I don't think that there are conversations around that. And so I think it's important to kind of see what youth want and see that the young person that wants to have a club, and then go from there. And then, like, the students will need an advisor or two to hopefully then start the club and kind of help them navigate maybe some of the logistics that they will need to do, like, face when talking to the principal or administration. And then with that it's be student-led. And I also emphasize that, well, so once you have a club, that really to allow space for young people to do what they want to do. Even though sometimes it could feel a little bit hard because you have many ideas. I have many ideas. And I notice I have to really make sure that, like, I'm taking a step back to say, like, hey, what do you want? And so, like, you may want a club that is the complete activist GSA. Again, that's great, but how about what the other young people want? Where are they at? And if you want that, like, how do you have conversation with each other to make sure that you create something like that? I think that's the other piece. And because the other part of it is having the adult GSA advisors sort of then completely step back and sort of be absent. And there has to be a communication between both parties, because the youth will have lots of ideas and they probably need somebody to help support them in the process and understand how to tailor that. And if they don't have that, then I think you have a little bit of an issue. So, so GSA advisor is there to sort of support and really kind of help steer in the direction that the youth want to go, and be a face also of the GSA club. I also think of who they are as staff, and just making sure that GSA club gets the recognition that it deserves at the end of the day. So.
Awesome. So if you're considering starting a GSA club at any point, we have some tips. Also, we've spent a lot of time talking about the GSA network, and Jen or any of your other coaches can connect you to us. But if you'd like some quick tips, like Luz Marina said, follow your school procedures, make sure that it's student initiated, but also familiarize yourself with the other rules around starting a school club. Each school has their own, or at least each school district has their own policy around how to start a club, so make sure you familiarize yourself with that. Having at least one advisor, Luz Marina mentioned having two. I really, in seeing a lot of different GSAs over time in this state, I think that the most successful ones have at least two advisors. Just splitting that workload, and also, having more than one person that's available, more than one adult identified for young people to connect to is also important. Let your administration know that you're interested in starting a GSA. You shouldn't have any problem with that because per the Equal Access Act, you are allowed to have a GSA. But let them know what you're doing just to keep it on the up and up, and support the young folks that are wanting to start the GSA. It should ideally be student-led. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will be for the first month or two or three. But support the young people in the best way that you can, and support their vision of the club. I think is a really important role of an advisor. Also developing a mission statement, tying into the three-part Venn diagram we were talking about earlier, deciding what your school needs in terms of its GSA is really important. And that mission statement may change from year to year. I definitely would recommend, if your school has a GSA, encouraging them to look at their mission statement if they haven't in a while, because it's really helpful to have an idea of what your mission is as a club. And then, developing guidelines and expectations. At the GSA network, we have a number of guidelines and expectations that we set up at the beginning of whether it's just a meeting with a few young people or it's a camp with a lot of young people, we set up guidelines and expectations for folks, just to create a sense of trust, first and foremost, but also to let members know that they are safe and they can be themselves in this space, and those guidelines would help.
So these two have shared a lot about how to start a GSA and the way to do that. But the great thing is that even though that's kind of a lot to take in, is that both of them can come into your school. They can meet with you. They can Skype with you. They can talk on the phone with you. So there's a lot of different ways that they can really walk you through this process. So that is what they're there for. Please don't feel like you have to go it alone. They're really great at giving support and technical assistance in that way.
That's true. That's true. We even have sample mission statements. Yeah, if you need help with those.
All right, so we're going to move from talking about GSA clubs as one way to create kind of a safer environment for not just the LGBTQ plus students, but all students. And another way that we're going to do that as well, or you can do that as well, is safe zones. So the things that are important about safe zones is that some folks talk about, oh, we've got some supportive teachers who are empathetic, and we've realized in talking with a lot of different schools, and especially school nurses, that that's just really a starting point. And so it's critical to have empathetic staff that, they care specifically about LGBTQ young people. They want to create a safe space, but it needs to go beyond that. So we really need to have empathetic and trained staff. It's really helpful to have identifiable spaces, and that's one piece of the safe zones, is that there are spaces that are labeled, whether it's an office or a classroom, that they're labeled as a safe zone. Sometimes students won't ever go to that staff member, that teacher, and say that they need support, but it might make them more likely to get assistance from them. Just seeing it up there might make them feel more comfortable in school. For me, when I went to college, and I wasn't very out yet, I was really nervous about who I could talk to, who I couldn't, and I just had this kind of constant operating uncomfortable edge with a lot of my professors. And I had actually a math professor that had the safe zone sticker up in his office, and that was the turning point for me to go and get some tutoring and help me through that class. I didn't ever talk to him about my personal life. I don't even think I ever came out to him. But the fact that he had that sign up, it told me, okay, he's going to be a safe person. And so even though I didn't need to talk about personal things, I reached out for support in a class that I might not have passed if I had not gotten his support. So the message, the sign, it sends a direct message, but it also sends this kind of indirect, subtle message that you may never realize. And so they serve multiple levels of purposes in addition to that really direct help. Now, some folks out there, and you may be one of them, and it's okay if you are, have printed out or found a safe zone sign and slapped it up on your office. My guess is most of the people who do that, they do have some sort of informal training. They, are maybe part of the LGBTQ community themselves. They've done a little bit of reading. They're maybe a little more informally trained than the average person out there. If you do have a safe zone sign up, I encourage you to do a little more reading, a little more about what the resources are. Hopefully this webinar will help a lot for that, as well as the other webinars in this whole series. But we don't just want to pass out signs and have everybody put signs up. We really want to make sure that people are trained. So some districts have not sanctioned or approved a district-wide program. And so individuals will put a sign up, and that's okay. But we also really want to push for the training behind it. So let's dig into a little bit more about safe zones and why they're important. So the safe zones programs, there's no one way to do it. Sometimes it's called safe zones. Sometimes it's called safe space. Sometimes it's called something totally different, or brave space. There's many different names. Safe zones, I think, is the most common one. But there's no cookie cutter across the nation way that folks do it. These two also started in colleges, typically in the 90s. And the original purpose, and you'll see this in many of the signs that are there, it was really directed towards supporting LGBTQ plus students at the schools. I would say most places now have broadened it, especially if we're looking at high school, middle school, elementary safe zones, is that while LGBTQ folks are centered in that, and our primary focus of providing education so staff can support them, that it really goes beyond that. It's looking at supporting everyone regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, learning ability, physical ability, intellect, social status, class, on and on and on. Did I leave anything out? I think I got a lot of them. So it really is about providing that support for many students who are marginalized or pushed to the edges in schools. So the safe zones, it typically identifies a specific space or an individual, right? We don't want to slap it on the front of the school. That's too broad to say, oh, this whole school is a safe zones. And in a safe zones program, it provides extra training to those staff around a variety of different topics. But the staff who choose to be a safe zones, they get some extra training, some extra support on how to best do that. Like I kind of told in my story, just having the sign up, it sends a message to all the queer and trans students, maybe the youth of color, the youth who have, are differently abled. Just by having that sign up, it sends an important message, even if they don't directly come to you. And it really is one way, it's not the only way, but one way to kind of promote a culture within your school, an environment of diversity and inclusion. And in many cases, it helps with bullying prevention efforts. And actually, that's how some folks have gotten funding for it, is that it can be wrapped into the district or the school's efforts to reduce bullying in their school. So what does it look like? These are kind of the ideal, the best practices. This doesn't mean that every district's going to look like this, but typically the best suggestion is to have it K through 12. When we're looking at elementary students, we're having more and more trans students come out younger and younger. We actually, and you probably remember this from the Trans 101 presentation as part of this, we actually have a concept of our gender much younger than we do of our sexuality. Right, so we have trans students that are coming out in elementary school more and more and younger and younger. Also, we've got students who have same-gendered parents, or they have brothers and sisters and family members who are LGBTQ. So it really supports lots of different types of families. It has some sort of visual identifier. The rainbow is really great to use because for the LGBTQ population, the rainbow is kind of an automatic aha, right? When you have LGBTQ students walking around, they just notice, they're constantly scanning, and they will see, as well as adults, they will see that rainbow and immediately kind of recognize it. It can be a sticker or poster that's unique to the district. It can be, certain agencies out there, you can buy them off the internet. Those are fine too. So lots of options for what it looks like, but something that identifies that space. And many of them have an actual blurb at the bottom that says, this is a safe space for all students, regardless of, including in some way, and it lists all those enumerated categories that I mentioned. Ideally, there's going to be an initial training and an orientation, but then there's going to be ongoing training kind of throughout the years. Throughout the school year, as well as year to year to year. And again, that training is going to be centered on the LGBTQ plus population, as well as other marginalized populations within that school. And that may shift of what kind of training happens one year to the next year. Sometimes the participants in the Safe Zones program can say, oh my gosh, we really need to learn more about how to support our undocumented students. Right, and so then you can create a training and bring in community providers to promote that sense of learning for that specific topic. So safe zones, they look different from district to district and school to school. Some of the best practices are that you have a collaborative planning team, and it's not just one person in the district that has this huge responsibility to do all this training and organize all these people, but instead to bring in community experts that focus on these areas, that have done this before and can really help support that. And we know that many of our schools are lacking in resources, and if you have community providers that can support you in this, it's a great way to bring them in. I know for some folks in rural areas, they may not think they have community providers. They might, that you might not know of, but also there are folks around the state, like the New Mexico GSA Network, the Trans Resource Center, that are available, and the UNM LGBTQ Resource Center, that are available to give coaching and support. Ideally, it includes your nurses, it includes your counselors, your administrators, and it includes educators. So something that I often hear from principals is they ask, well, I think every teacher should be part of this. How is a teacher not a safe person? So the reality is that not every teacher is a safe person for LGBTQ plus young folks. In an ideal world, that might be true. But also with a volunteering for the Safe Zone program is you're putting yourself out there a little bit to say, I am willing, I'm inviting young people to come talk to me if they need support. Now, some folks, they just want to go in and they want to teach biology and focus on biology, and they don't have the capacity, the time, the energy to further put themselves out there. And that's okay, because their job is to teach biology, right? And support students in learning biology. So not every teacher is comfortable putting themselves out there a little bit more. And again, it's not trying to turn teachers into counselors that are going to do all this counseling, but just provide a little bit of support and help connect them to resources. There are a few populations that I'm comfortable with saying, when doing a training, that it is mandatory. For example, counselors. Essentially, it's already an integral part of their job to support students and be a safe place. So I think it's fair to say we want all of our counselors to participate in the Safe Zones training and be safe zones. But especially for other staff, educators, administrators, it's important that they volunteer for it. Another reality of how to really get it to work is that it's incentivized in some way. So either it's during the school day and the staff are able to leave their school site and come to a training and the subs are paid for, so there's not a burden on the school, or maybe it's after school hours or on Saturdays, but there's stipends, there's professional development stipends paid to the teachers and counselors and nurses, etc. So anytime it can be incentivized, it really helps and it values the extra training that they're getting and putting in to be a safe zones. So here is kind of a list of where to start if you want to start a safe zones at your district. And again, your coaches can help you with this. The first thing is get the Safe Zone program endorsed by the school or district. Identify a point person, someone who's at least going to be kind of the air traffic controller and kind of direct things and keep things organized. Look around at who your community collaborators are, and if you don't know of any in your community, reach out to your coaches, GSA, Trans Resource Center, and we can help with that. You always want to start with an orientation and letting Safe Zones volunteers know what they're volunteering for, and also what they're not, that they're not expected to be counselors, that they're not expected to, go kind of cross those clinical boundaries, that they're really just supposed to support students and connect them to resources. And then look to your Safe Zones participants, your community collaborators, and come up with a training schedule, topic menu, kind of a support network so they can talk to each other. And that those trainings, they look different. Some school districts will do 4 in a year, some will do 3, 2. Sometimes school districts they're back to bare bones and they can only do 1 a year or promote online training. So there's lots of different kind of options within that. So here are some frequently asked questions. This is whenever I'm talking about safe zones, what I often get asked is one, can't we just put the stickers up? Can't we just put the signs up? Safe zones, the strength in safe zones is the training that goes behind it and understanding, as well as knowing what resources are out there for young people. An ability to recognize some issues popping up. So the training component is really critical. I talked a bit about the mandating. Should all teachers and school staff be mandated? And that's important to say no, except for those few exceptions, like possibly, oops, there we go. That's taking you to the next slide. Alrighty, so, it shouldn't be mandated for everyone, right, except for possibly counselors and sometimes nurses. Next, is it just for LGBTQ plus students? So like I said, when it started, it often was focused on that, and LGBTQ plus students should still be centered, but we really want to look at all the different issues that our marginalized students are facing. I mean, even LGBTQ students, they are not just LGBTQ. They are gay, and they are gender nonconforming, and they are undocumented. Right, so they've got multiple things going on, but they're also dealing with language. They're dealing with being a person of color. Maybe they have ability issues. Maybe they have class issues. So those many different intersections of the different identities, and we really want to promote a way that we're supporting the whole person and not just one aspect. Folks often ask about what are some topics. So obviously the LGBTQ 101, talking about specifically transgender and gender nonconforming issues, working with students of color, specifically undocumented students, anti-oppression and bias training, bullying, skills for staff of de-escalating situations, also just kind of recognizing issues, having a difficult conversation with a young person, suicide prevention, what resources to refer folks to. Those are all, training topics that can be pulled apart, mushed together, kind of in multiple combinations.
And I would add, even for that one, also kind of, because you are your school, you know your community, kind of see what's the need there. What are you seeing that folks would really benefit from? Because ultimately at the end of the day, you're the person who knows what's happening in your own community. And so when you're working with community partners and bringing them to do a safe zone, you could say, hey, I would really like to focus on this too. Can you include this? Because I noticed this is something we should talk about. And so also think about that, because you are also experts in where you are teaching or being your staff member at. So I would add that as well to that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And then the last thing, what if I want to show support, but I'm not qualified as a counselor? Just really want to reiterate that this is not a training program to turn folks into counselors. We really just want to help staff at school be a non-judgmental adult who's going to listen, and then be able to refer those young folks to further resources if they need them, or just be someone who listens and they know that they're safe with. All right, so we're going to kind of move along to the third piece of this presentation, which is about model policy. And so we're going to focus on kind of two types of model policy. The first one is around anti-bullying and harassment. The second one is about transgender, gender nonconforming students. So for the anti-bullying and harassment policy, there's these overarching policies, and in many school districts you have the policy and then you have kind of the how to implement this, which in some cases is called an administrative regulation or a procedural directive, right? So there's some different layers, and so depending how your school or district policies are written, I'm just going to kind of say policy, but it might be under the procedural directive or the administrative regulation. There's also some good resources out there from the National School Board Association, and we do have state law that covers this. And our state law could use a little bit of strengthening. There's some legislation at play that may or may not get passed that'll strengthen it. But in looking at that, we've learned a lot about what strengthens policy. So I've been privileged enough to work with several school districts here in the state and help them write or rewrite their policies. And so that's where my expertise and information is coming from. So it's kind of a conglomerate of a bunch of different policies molded into best practices. So if we're looking at anti-bullying and harassment, it's important to have a really clear definition of bullying that really outlines what is bullying, because there's going to be a lot of instances where it's poor behavior, it's inappropriate behavior, but it might not be bullying. So it's important to have that clear definition so that those who are implementing the policy can know and figure out whether it's bullying or not, as well as the reach of the policy. So now most best practice policies around bullying, specifically with cyberbullying, are saying that if it affects the school climate, then the school has the kind of the jurisdiction to manage that. So even if the cyberbullying took place at 2 a.m. at home via Snapchat, if that student coming to school is suffering kind of a hostile climate or an unsafe climate, then the school does have kind of the ability, the responsibility even, to address those instances of cyberbullying, even though it may not have happened on the school grounds behind a computer. And so that's definitely one way that things have shifted, especially with cyberbullying, because before it was just what was happening on school grounds. So schools do have a little bit more reach now, and kind of can and should have more reach if it's affecting the school climate. So I want to talk a little bit about zero tolerance policies. They came from a good place. They came from a place of saying, we're not going to tolerate bullying, it's not okay, so we have zero tolerance for bullying. But unfortunately, the way that's actually manifested is zero tolerance means one strike and you're out. So if there's an instance of bullying, then that person is, very quickly removed from the school, whether they're suspended or expelled immediately. it doesn't help correct that behavior. It doesn't help the young person who is perpetrating the bullying, who possibly is also being bullied himself or herself or was in the past. It doesn't help them correct that behavior, make that shift, and that's what ultimately will change the school culture. Transferring them to a different school, just kicking them out, it doesn't really change their behavior. So working with them, helping them have, you know, corrective action around that behavior, and those are typically called restorative justice practices. We talked a little bit about that in the bullying webinar. If you haven't seen that yet, you will be. But in general, zero tolerance policies are not effective. And then the other point is that it must include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Currently in our state law, in February 2017, sexual orientation is protected, but gender identity and gender expression are not explicitly protected. So that could change as legislation may or may not change, but when you're working with your district, if you're advocating, right, for policies to be improved, this is a great time to implement it at the district level because it's so critical that students are protected based on these things. So here's some key components. And you can kind of think of these as like the headers with details below it. There is going to be a template provided as a handout that will include a lot of this with some more information behind each thing, each point. So the first is just an intention purpose statement, just, you know, the district or school declaring that, you know, bullying is not a, you know, approved supported behavior. We want a safe environment for all of our students for learning, you know, something along those lines. The second piece of the statement of scope, it could only cover the students. It could cover the students and the staff. There's multiple ways that that can happen, but really being specific, who is covered under this bullying policy. Number 3, specification of prohibited conduct. That's just fancy way for saying the definition of bullying, like really laying out what's prohibited. 4 is the enumerated categories. So it is really critical that in this place you list, you know, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, race, class, ethnicity, ability, language spoken, documentation status, even teen and pregnant parenting status is a good one that we've been advocating for. Just any type of category that those most marginalized are often picked on for. This doesn't mean that's only who the policy covers for. It's just you're specifically outlining that we are really paying attention to these students and we're going to make sure that they're covered because a lot of times they're not. So it doesn't rule out anyone who doesn't fit one of those categories is still totally covered under this policy. It's often a question I get asked. So next, the incident management reporting procedure. So this is kind of from the administrative side. How do you handle when there's been an incident of bullying? So how does the young person report it? Or how does a parent report it? What's the procedure? Who does it go to? Do they fill out a form? Is there not a form? Who's the correct contact person? And then when that contact person gets this report or learns about this incident of bullying, how do they investigate? How do they handle it? How do they follow up? And how do they document and track that they're doing these things? Then next is these sanctions or consequences. And this is where we don't want to have zero tolerance. We want to, you know, encourage things around referring to counseling resources or other types of corrective action, but really kind of clarifying what some of the consequences are. It's great to have a section that is talking about preventative education, saying that the school district will conduct bullying prevention lessons, specifying how many lessons a year or which grade levels, that sort of thing. Whatever the district's plan is, really spelling it out so that there is that preventative education for the students as well as for the staff to make sure the staff are trained in bullying and harassment. And then the last is just accountability. How are they going to track that? How are we going to know that schools are reporting it to the district, etc. So that kind of wraps up the anti-bullying and harassment. So now we'll move on to the transgender and gender nonconforming. So first, Title IX, which most of us think about equal opportunity in athletics for women, right? That's usually what connotates what people, you know, think of first. Title IX actually does apply to trans and gender nonconforming students. There's guidance by the Department of Justice, the Department of Education. There is what's called a Dear Colleague letter which was a really heavy hand in saying, yes, Title IX protects students on the basis of sex discrimination and sexual harassment. It is being challenged in the Supreme Court right now, so we will probably have more clarity on this. It's the Gavin Grimm case. I'm not sure exactly when it's being heard, but this may or may not change in the future. So by the time you're watching this webinar, feel free to reach out to us for clarification on how this applies to public schools through Title IX. However, an even better thing to do besides just relying on Title IX is to actually have a policy specific to protecting trans and gender non-conforming policies. So in a minute, I'm going to review some key components that are based on model policies, and I'm going to share that template as a handout. So that model policy is based on 3 different areas. It's GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. They have kind of a large document that will also be available that is some details on model policy. Then the San Francisco Unified School District, which had a trans and gender nonconforming policy for I think at least 10 years. I think at this point it's been 12 or 13 without having any incidences. And then the District of Arcadia, which is a school district in California, had a corrective action plan from the Department of Education where a student successfully sued the school, and the Department of Education said, here's what you need to do to properly be implementing Title IX and not discriminating against the student. So those 3 different things kind of informed a best practices policy. 2 very, very similar, almost identical policies were implemented last year in Albuquerque Public Schools and Santa Fe Public Schools. And so here's an example where the policy is really discrimination, right? And then the procedural directive in Albuquerque Public Schools and the administrative regulation in Santa Fe Public Schools then outlines how do they protect trans and gender nonconforming students in schools. So here we go to some of the key components. So one is talking about privacy. So FERPA is essentially the HIPAA within schools. So, and many of you nurses probably are familiar with both. But that essentially is talking about privacy. What can you share with parents? What can you share with other teachers? So in the template, it talks about when it is appropriate to share the transgender students or gender nonconforming students kind of gender identity, gender expression, and when not. How to handle official records. So most of our youth are minors, depending if they're able to change their birth certificate and their legal name. In New Mexico, it's really challenging. You actually have to have, right now, you have to have surgery in order to change your birth certificate. Right now, in the legislature, there's many of us that are advocating that no one should be forced to alter their body. Some folks can't afford it. Some folks, medically, it doesn't work. Some folks just don't want to, right? So you shouldn't have to. So we're trying to change that. But for now, young folks really can't do that in New Mexico easily, so they can't change the birth certificate. So the official records that has their transcripts, et cetera, you have to match that with student ID numbers, and there's many ways around that. So student information systems can often have a preferred name and preferred gender pronoun in that category, along with their assigned sex at birth and their name on birth certificate. And then it's actually very easy to link the two because the student ID number is the same. So both Santa Fe and Albuquerque has already been working with the student information systems to make sure that that lines up. In the policy, a section about names and pronouns, essentially saying that staff and other students will respect the student's name that they wish to be called and the pronoun they wish to be recognized as. That is, it's not an option for the teachers to follow it or not, that their pronoun is their pronoun and their name is their name, period. Restrooms and locker rooms, this is the big one that everyone is really concerned about. And I want to lead with trans students and gender non-conforming students are not, and adults as well, are not the perpetrators in restrooms. They are often the target, often the victim. So a lot of the advertising around protecting, the other girls is actually false, because typically it's the trans student who ends up getting victimized or hurt in the locker room. So a good policy will say that students will use the restroom of their identity. So, and any student who's uncomfortable may use an available single-stall restroom, which is often in the nurse's room, which means if I am a cisgender girl, as a student, and I'm uncomfortable with a trans girl using the restroom, They're not going to make the trans student go use the restroom. I get to go use the restroom across campus, right? So it's not further traumatizing and discriminating that trans student, but it is also protecting all students, saying, if you're uncomfortable using the restroom with others, okay, no problem, you may go use the nurse's room. And so that holds true if you're a trans student, if you're a cisgender student, doesn't matter, anyone uncomfortable, use that restroom. Athletics, there are some processes and waivers around falling within the New Mexico Athletic Association, but essentially saying students should be allowed to participate in the athletics of their gender, and dress code, that they would follow the dress code of their gender, which also means they also have the same, abide by the same rules of hat or no hat, or skirt length, or any of those kind of nuances around dress code, but that it would apply to them as their true felt gender identity. All right, so that was a lot around policy, and so let's kind of circle back to making it more concrete about what you can actually do. So take it away, Chris.
Cool. So yeah, some tips about how to make your school safer and more welcoming for LGBTQ students. Asking about gender pronouns is huge. Having an adult that works in your school ask you, hey, I'm not completely sure, what gender pronouns do you prefer, is really, really, I can't think of the word. Critical, definitely, critical. And also just means a lot to the young folks that you all are working with. Also, having some visuals up in your office, posters, stickers, pamphlets, things. Often in my nurse's office in high school, there were lots of pamphlets about safe sex, but there wasn't one available about anything queer related whatsoever. So also that's a consideration to have. Also encouraging trainings on LGBTQ plus issues. The I Am Me video is amazing. And hosting a screening of it is pretty easy, but if you'd like some help, Jen would be more than happy to help you. Also bringing in other organizations to do different trainings, you know, is an option for your school. No matter where you live in the state, we can figure it out, we can make it to you, or we can Skype in, and definitely connect with your coaches for that. Supporting your school's GSA club, you do not have to be the advisor for the club to support the club, to come to the meetings, or even just to encourage students to attend the meetings, letting them know that they happen and when and where. Also, if you're able to participate in Safe Zones trainings, being part of the Safe Zones program is really important if you already have one in place. And also putting up the signs, again, in the same vein as having these aids up, whether it's just a rainbow sticker, a safe zone sign, a poster, or anything in your classroom that lets young people know that you're a safe person to come to is really important. And also ensuring that your school allows access to appropriate LGBTQ plus websites. So at my school, and I'm not sure if it's changed now, but at the school that I went to in high school, anything that had like lesbian or gay in it was flagged as like pornographic content. So, you know, just making sure if you're referring young people to the Trevor Project, they should be able to access it at school, because, you know, that's a completely appropriate website for someone to be accessing. Additionally, encouraging LGBTQ plus curriculum being taught in the school, of course. Like I said before, if there's any pamphlets or flyers or handouts that you all can have in your offices as nurses, you have a really unique position to support students in a way that no one else in the school gets to. And also participating in days of action. There are a lot of different days of action that we can you know, tell you how to get involved with them, or the easiest ways to do so. So, yep.
Cool. All right, resources.
Yeah. So what's great, sometimes I do webinars and I'm like, oh, so many things were said at me. I don't even know what are some concrete things. So resources. These are a number of resources that we have compiled for you all to start looking at. So obviously we're here to kind of assist you in any way possible, and there's other ways too. So I mentioned earlier that we're one of the pilot programs from the Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network, and that they have a number of resources you can go ahead and just print right out. And even if you actually email them and you're from New Mexico, they will then even forward the email to us, which is great. We've got a number of connections that way. So we see you all reaching out to them, as well as GLSEN. So they're great for finding out really good stats on information. If you're like, hey, I need a couple stats to bring to my principal, definitely look at GLSEN and see some of their resources on their website. And Lambda Legal and Transgender Law Center are awesome resources when you're thinking about policy, about changing the specific law that they're working on. They're really kind of at the forefront when it comes to creating equal access for all folks around housing, health, school, and they have a number of programs, both of them, that really address education as well.
Lots of student know your rights stuff too.
Yes, which is awesome. Yeah.
Well, as always, we love to thank our school nurse reviewers who help us with this webinar and make sure the content matches what you need. And here's our contact info. Feel free to reach out to any of us for anything you need. And we will gladly support you in every endeavor that you undertake to make your school safer and braver. So thank you so much.
Yay.
All right, recording's off.
Cool.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the